Hello, and welcome to the Leaders Commute, a new monthly podcast series presented by Acuity Business Consulting and produced by Business RadioX. I'm your host, Jess Villegas, principal of Acuity Business Consulting, and we are coming to you from the Subaru of Gwinnett studio inside the Gas South Convention Center in Duluth, Georgia. Acuity is a business performance consultancy working with leadership teams to translate their talent and resources into exceptional and sustainable organizational performance. We do this by surfacing actionable clarity and providing execution expertise in the areas of strategic design, financial management, operational excellence, and leadership development so that leadership can confidently navigate their organizations towards next-level performance. As an executive and leadership expert, I constantly reflect on the dynamics that keep individuals, whether at the executive, middle management, or line level, consistently engaged to meet the objectives of their respective roles. I believe a major factor includes how one relates their work to connection in their lives. More specifically, it is a connection born from recalling past experiences in certain work contexts, particularly those that persistently and unwittingly surface throughout the day-to-day of our lives. The organizing theme for the Leaders Commute podcast is that throughout the commute of our lives, we adopt and release, mostly subconsciously, experiences that inform our assumptions about how to conduct business. Over the next several months, I will offer an informal strategy for how leaders can leverage their past impactful experiences in a more conscious way to result in better business performance. Mitchell Feigenbaum, a mathematical physicist, said, "The wondrous promise of the earth is that there are things beautiful in it, things wondrous and alluring, and by virtue of your trade, you want to understand them. In this respect, my past experiences and connection to them are what serve me in my trade. The challenge for you is to make your connections within the context of your trade and relate them to how you manage in your leadership roles. I would like to declare up front, this podcast is not intended to be a vehicle for self-aggrandizement, a retelling of enemies vanquished or hard challenges conquered or of past wrongs ultimately righted. It is for reflecting on circumstances that have fallen short of my desired outcomes. Some might call those failures, but I see them as a test of my willingness to learn from them, to elevate my awareness towards better decisions as I proceed along my life's commute." The title of today's episode is The Russian Junkman, a story of what we choose to collect and release throughout our lives and for what reasons. By the way, past experiences do not only accrue to formal leaders. We all lead something at any given point in our lives, even if it's only ourselves. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share this experience with you. It seemed particularly important at breakfast that Saturday morning in the summer of one of my high school years to study the lacerations, bruises, blood, and ink stains on my father's forearms and bony hands. These were the products of decades working as a print shop entrepreneur, pounding out brochures, flyers, and wedding invitations in a frantic race to deliver products on time. No brochures, no open house. No flyers, no grand opening. No wedding invitations, no wedding. Maybe. Back in the days before digital printing, there was an art to the work of offset printing and the activities that accompanied it, like typesetting, printing plate development, camera and artwork, and the operation of large, clunky printers in a demanding environment in an effort to produce high-quality print media. It was important and honorable work, but the price was a daily collision of heavy pinch-point machinery against valuable extremities. Cuts and bruises were standard, but too often my father would cover up a snatched fingernail from a fast-rotating, rubber-coated printer drum with multiples of low-quality Band-Aids. This morning I was preparing to defend what I thought was an easy decision, speaking to my parents with an animation not normally in my repertoire. I'd hoped that they would notice my own cuts and bruises and oil-stained hands and trade in that empathy to make my case. It was time for me to move on from my once promising summer job. My injuries were the product of my first full week at this job, which looked really good on paper. Minimum wage at the time was barely $1.50 an hour. But any young man who had the initiative to jump on their 10-speed bike ride to City Hall, and search bulletin boards for opportunity, might score something closer to $2 an hour. This was sizable girlfriend money, and so I made the call to this prospective employer, hoping I was not coming too late to the opportunity. I was caught off guard when Mr. Bilgi answered the phone, and I realized he barely spoke a word of English. It took a while for the conversation to flow, but in time, I made out the questions he was pushing past what I guessed to be a heavy Russian accent. Where do you live? I gave him my address. You work hard? Yes, I blurted in my most professional voice. You big and strong? Yes, I said again. Not quite as forceful, but still professional. Honestly, I was more big than I was strong, but my first attempts at resume nuance seemed to go off without a hitch. You work Monday? He asked. This was an unexpected complication. Leslie, my girlfriend and my eventual wife, and I had plans for that coming Monday. We were going to do some of this summer stuff and that summer stuff and the kind of summer stuff we had pretty much been doing all summer. I rationalized quickly that maybe she and I could get an early start this particular Monday, spend some time together, and then roll into my new job about lunchtime. So I said yes. Mr. Bilger said, I pick you up at 6 a.m. He did not wait for a response and continued, you bring gloves. And then he hung up. No one should be getting up before 10 a.m. during a California summer unless they're going to the beach to surf. At 5:59 a.m., I could hear Mr. Bilgi clambering down our small residential street, but could not see until he was directly in front of my house that he was in an empty 20-foot stake bed truck. He waved me into the truck and then waved to my dad as he climbed into his Chevy truck. It just now occurring to me this is when he left for work every morning. We rumbled out of my quiet neighborhood and into suburban Los Angeles traffic. I resisted my urge to start asking Mr. Bilgi more questions about the job, as he seemed intent on watching the road and on getting to wherever we were going. He was an older, gruff-looking man, stocky, with massive arms and made him look as wide as he was tall. After 30 minutes or so, I realized it might be quite a long time before we arrived at our destination. From the combination of his truck and the request for me to bring gloves, I deduced the likelihood of some type of physical labor, but I decided to get more information while we were en route. Where are we going? He did not look at me, but for a split second he released both hands off the steering wheel, raised his arms with palms to the sky, gave what looked like a raise the roof celebration, and mumbled, "You pick up." After an hour, we arrived at a used car dealership. We worked our way around to the back of the lot where there stood an array of abandoned car frames, broken doors, mangled rims, and bent bumpers, appearing to have resided there for an exceptionally long period of time, covered in dust and oil and emitting a mirage of heat from the summer sun. These residuals of the auto body work done on site seemed to meld together in an unseemly aggregate of pop art, and I could see it was going to be my job to deconstruct it. Mr. Bilgi pulled as close as he could to the pile of junk, and he motioned me out of the cab. I began to stretch on my gloves, and before I was done, he was already positioned atop his truck, giving me the raise the roof sign. Not sure where to start, I grabbed the lightest, cleanest piece of junk I could find and lifted it to him. He frowned, set the object off to the side, pointed at a car door with the broken glass, and said, "That one." The door was extremely heavy, and I experienced a bout of panic as I considered how I was going to lift this monstrosity into the truck. I finally worked out I could brace against adjacent pieces of junk, stiffen my back, and rework my gripping angles so that I could finally lift the door. I had it barely an inch over my head, well short of the side of the truck, when in one grand motion, Mr. Bilgi reached over, made up the gap between us, and with one hand grabbed the door and strategically placed it toward the front of the truck. He nodded at me and pointed to the next piece that he wanted. Then he took the first piece I gave him, nestled it neatly between the two he already had, and then motioned to the broken fender. I looked down at the heavy scratch on my arm, the tears on my insubstantial gloves, and the filth transferred to my clothes, and began feeding him more material in a carefully choreographed sequence over roughly the next 30 minutes. We repeated this routine many times over the next several hours and days, the long drives between each location becoming welcomed opportunities to rest. The pattern was broken whenever the truck was full, and we rerouted to drop the load at the salvage yard. Anticipating an equally painful unloading of the carefully placed material, I was grateful when Mr. Bilgi made use of his barely operable hydraulics to tip the bed into the fill pits. The salvage yard supervisor wrote out a check for the mangled steel, and then we went out for another round. Over the balance of the week, my arms and hands collected various cuts and scrapes, while my clothes got thicker with soot. Besides the opportunity for rest, the lengthy commutes between stops allowed me to ruminate on a number of things at the same time. What would it cost to replace my ruined clothes? Am I going to need a tetanus shot? Will I get paid in cash? Was there an extra set of thicker gloves in the truck? Was traffic always this bad? Does Mr. Bilgi have any kids? Did my dad always leave at 6 a.m. for work? A wild, undisciplined mind doing its best to distract me from the work to be done at the next stop. Few things about the entire experience gave any comfort except for when Mr. Bilgi could find the occasional Dodger day game to listen to on the radio. Listening, I was reminded that the audio exploits of Buckner, Russell, Lopes, and Say were often resident in my dad's truck. Nice listening memories during Sunday afternoon games. My dad had a relatively strong Spanish accent, but he was much easier to understand than Mr. Bilgi. It was odd to have these two men occupy the same thought. They both got up early for work, they were both diligent workers, and both loved listening to the Dodger broadcasts. So did I. No matter if Russian, Spanish, or English, none of it was necessary to understand Vin Scully's joyous banter. Friday finally rolled around, and it was time for my big payday. I made fast work of the calculation. 5 days of work, 6 a.m. to 5 p.m., 11 hours per day, $2 per hour, $110. Mr. Bilgi stopped at the grocery mart to buy a couple of Cokes and cash his checks. He got in the cab and asked, "You have girlfriend?" "Yes." He smiled like he knew what the money was for, handed me a Coke, and gave me $35. My mom and dad did not require that I have a summer job, but they made it clear that if I needed money, I would have to earn it. There was no extra money for weekly allowances or gifts for girlfriends. I understood this, but I was looking for some relief of my conscience against their constant parental barrage of messaging. Don't start what you cannot finish. Always give 2 weeks' notice. Good jobs are hard to find. But Dad, this was not a good job. $35 for 55 hours of work. That's barely 65 cents an hour. No response. Plus, I've ruined most of my clothes. No response. He never told me on the phone that he was paying me only for the time I was physically lifting the junk. My mom jumped in. "Well, what did he say?" "Not much of anything," I said. I could barely understand him. I anticipated her next comment to be, "That's what questions are for," but she was too sweet for that kind of admonishing. Instead, what I got was, "It seems kind of late for him to find another helper." I decided to give him 1 more week of work. You might guess what a recap of all the learnings from this experience would look like. Ask more questions, get agreements up front, fight for your money, don't agree to a second week of work. But the only strategy my resentment would allow was to just work more slowly in my final week. During a few of our many stops, I happened to notice that Mr. Bilgi would glance at his watch intently, prompting me to think that I was in danger of losing this sweet gig because I was not working fast enough. And so I would buckle down and speed it up. Looking back, I realized the faster I worked, the less money I made. In my consulting practice, I place heavy emphasis on building business acumen of everyone in the organization. This is because every member of the organization makes decisions, formally or informally, that affect the financial well-being of the business. Multiple orders of impacts of decisions must be understood to properly influence how each member must behave on behalf of the business and one individual cannot have all the information that is needed for proper decision making. But the concept is hard to articulate to levels of the organization not familiar with all the business processes. To address this challenge, I utilize what I call an evolving context, which is the recognition that specific types of our past experiences can assist us in understanding our current modes of thinking. My story about the Russian Junkman is an evolving context in the following respect. For the first 10 years of recounting this story to family and friends, I held a deep resentment about the experience. I felt that I had been taken advantage of because of my youth, and the only moral of the story I could muster was, don't ever be a sucker again. With more experience, the story evolved to one of tempered resentment, along with a grudging admission that perhaps I could have done some things differently. Maybe I should have asked more questions. Maybe I was so enamored with the money that I did not care to hear about the details. Maybe I should have given Mr. Belgi the benefit of the doubt, if only because he reminded me so much of my dad. After all, week 2 did seem more bearable. I learned a little Russian. I started building some muscle mass in time for the beach season. I improved my ability to choose the right collection of stuff to maximize what could be loaded into the truck. I got to learn about his family and a little about Russia, the non-Cold War version. In the most recent decades of my career, I understood there was absolutely a more constructive way of looking at the entire experience. It, along with the scores of other lessons learned and patterns discerned, allowed me to take a more holistic view of the situation. More importantly, I realized I was fully responsible for the outcomes that I had in creating the situation. I now credit this experience as grounding for how I think about communication, expectations, resource utilization, equipment maintenance, return on investment, and cost-benefit analysis. A word about communication. In retrospect, my challenge with Mr. Bilgi was somewhat about not speaking the same language and about asking more questions and being a better listener. But more important, it was about being clear on expectations and the problems that arise when they are not clear. There's a lyric in a song written by the Irish balladeer Damien Rice that reads, "You give me miles and miles of mountains when I ask for the sea." Imagine the resentment that can build between bosses, colleagues, and direct reports when extraordinary expectations and substantial deliverables do not match. My story has been evolving and teaching me for almost 5 decades. It grows as I grow. It has taken a life of its own, even though the facts of the experience have not changed at all. The things to consider when determining if you have an evolving context and past experience candidate are pretty straightforward. Do the same recollections keep coming to you over and over without any prompting at all? Does the experience elicit some strong emotions such as elation, joy, bliss, shame, or disgust? Do you enjoy relating the story, even if it does not put you in the best light? Is there some element of the story that remains draped in ambiguity, one that does not have a life or death implication, but has nevertheless not surfaced an answer for you? This will play a big role in keeping the story alive. For me, that element in my Russian Junkman story was the realization that the harder I worked, the less money I made. The counterintuitive nature of this fascinated me. My teenager solution was to just work slower. I was not proud of that decision, but somehow I rationalized my behavior. My adult solutions need to consider how I'm leading those around me, and if I have created an environment where effort aligned is converted to meaningful results and rewards. One final note. One of my favorite Dodgers was Sandy Koufax, an extraordinary pitcher who played in the 1960s. In the 5 years preceding his retirement, he won 111 games and had an earned run average of 1.77, 1.5 points lower than the league average for all pitchers. In his final year before he retired, he pitched 27 complete games. Several of them are only 2 or 3 days of rest. In 2022, only 35 complete games were thrown in the entire league. There's a story told about him that he was once one strike away from one of his 4 no-hitters when the third baseman yells out, "Come on, Sandy, get the no-hitter." He burned the pitch to home plate, and the umpire yells, "Strike 3." The batter says, "I couldn't see the ball. Where was the pitch?" The umpire replies, "I don't know, but it sounded like a strike." I relate this story because if you are growing, your evolving context will never be complete. I assume Mr. Bilgi will continue to teach me, but I don't know what those new lessons will be until I need them. In the meantime, they will keep coming at me like Sandy Koufax fastballs. I will not always see them, but I know they will likely be strikes.
Strike 3. Batty caught looking. Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout, his second consecutive shutout.
So, that's my story. It looks like one of our producers, Mike Salmon, looks like maybe you have a couple of questions for me.
I will overlook the fact that you're a Dodgers fan. And yes, I did have a couple of questions. You covered a lot of concepts there, but you talked about the idea of the commute, and it seems like there's a connection between the Russian Junkman and the truck. Can you talk more about that? Is there like a coincidence about that?
Well, that was just kind of a little bit forced, but kind of what prompted that was in one of the millions of times that I recounted the story, I mentioned it to someone, and after listening, he said, "Wow, that was a lot of time in the truck." And I said, "Yeah, about 75% of my time was not productive at all." And he goes, "Yeah, that's a hell of a commute." And I thought, well, okay. So in that experience, I realized that the commute was allowing me to think about how I might want to approach things. And over time, I started realizing that I was collecting things and making decisions about whether I was going to hold on to them. The other thing I was thinking about was, as I'm thinking about people who are commuting to their jobs, oftentimes it's a pretty mindless experience, right? So I'm not advocating for the idea that somehow you should listen to books or discuss philosophy with your friends while you're on the commute. But there is some trick to be mindful at it.
Or listen to podcasts.
Or listen to podcasts like this one. Exactly.
Exactly.
So, and then finally, I guess I would say I am definitely in the camp of it is the journey, not the destination. And for me, the journey just screams commute.
Well, that truck was like your classroom.
It was. It still is.
Would you count this high school story that you just shared with us as one of the early stories that you plan to maybe cover in your future shows?
I think it's probably one of the earliest. I do have kind of one more experience that I'm kind of working through, and it had to do with a childhood illness that was not catastrophic, but it was impactful, and that happened a few years before high school. But I started thinking back. It seems like life began when I started dating my wife. So every big story seems to have a high school bent to it.
Your story there, Jess, it read like a well written novel. I mean, the story was I loved how you played it out. Are there some books out there that have significantly impacted the evolution of your ideas over the years?
Yes, there are several I've read. I've just kind of completed 2 books. One of them is called the CEO Excellence, and it was from a group of authors that's closely associated with the McKinsey Consulting Group. I'm currently reading a book called Organizational Physics by Lex Cisney. But 2 other books that inform kind of the way I think about some of the concepts I laid out here are Seeing Systems by Barry Oshry, and also another book called Leadership and Self-Deception, which is put out by the Arbinger Institute.
One more question for you, Jess, if that's okay. You kind of touched upon it while you were sharing your story, but can you give an example of how the story that you just told us is impacting how you work and how you do your work today?
Yes. Prior to COVID, kind of the sweet spot for the clients I was working with in terms of revenue was kind of between 15 to 50 million. And that worked well for what I was doing. I was either running companies of that size or I was working on consulting projects for companies of that size. Since COVID, and since I've elected to do a little less traveling than I used to, that whole sweet spot has had to shift downward to less than 15 to 50 million. And what I've found is the lower you go on that revenue pecking order, the more complex the problems can be. And a lot of those problems happen because you have less and less resources trying to do more and more things. And then things become more and more complex for those individuals. They start to become overwhelmed. So I realize now that for me to help those companies work through that, I need to be even more intentional in my listening. And then I need to be very, very clear. If someone tells me something, I make it very clear to say it back to them in a way that lets them nod back to me and says, yes, you understand what I need. And then if I get to that point, I can put together a proposal.
Well, thanks, Jess, for letting me ask a few questions there at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Leaders Commute podcast presented by Acuity Business Consulting. If you would like to reach out to me, you can do so at area code 678-644-9311 or email me at jess@Acuity Business Consulting. You can catch a new episode every month here on Business Radio X, or you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. Until next time, I'm Jess Villegas, and you've been listening to The Leaders Commute on Business Radio X.